This is Lance Wolf, and this is Ironwolf Productions, and this is the S7 Warhawk. I should state some things first about the Warhawk. It's an older model. I built this model in '96, and at the time, I'd already figured out how I wanted the design to look, but the markings and whatnot, you see, the story has since changed, as you do with any story. It's been rewritten several times, and the markings on the model have changed. So when it came time to redo the director's guide for this, to create this massive production Bible, is what I'm working on for the story Magnesium Bow, it meant that every model had to get a new paint job, new markings, and be brought up to date. As for this particular model, I wanted to try something new. I wanted to actually print out panels to decorate the model, to kind of give it a different look. You know, as an artist, you're always trying new things and new challenges, and it was just a unique opportunity to try something different with the markings on this particular model. This way I could have all the symbols I wanted, and the most important thing, mission marks. A great influence on my work is World War II, and I thought, like the old B-17 bombers had mission marks on the nose of the ship. I thought, if you're a student of the art of war, when you're trying to be a writer, you try to study everything you can, and I thought this would be a perfect way to antagonize the enemy, is to show the mission marks on the model, that they would be so boldly displayed if you can antagonize your opponent. It was another psychological warfare, and I thought, just like a B-17 from World War II has mission marks, I would have mission marks on my ships and vehicles. Now, to address certain questions that I constantly get from people on the design of my models is, why don't I have lights on them? Well, lights would denote windows, and again, I'm doing sort of World War II in the future kind of a thing. Like a battleship in World War II running at night doesn't have lights. There might be a signaling light to signal another ship, but there aren't really any running lights on it. Think of this ship as like a submarine. There isn't any lights on it, and there aren't any windows either. This is a warship, and to have windows, it just doesn't seem to make sense to me. However, on some of my ships, the only window you would see would be the bridge. And I would think some of the other influences of that, where I've tried my best to come up with my own style. I've worked so hard to make sure that my art has its own look and style to it, so it doesn't look like everyone else's. And that's also going into my ship design. My design aesthetic, to come up with a unique design aesthetic, I started using the thought of parsimony, both economically and philosophically, in my designs. And that's how, form dictates function. Like the specifics for this ship, all that kind of stuff goes into the design, and then once you start something, to keep that world, you don't want to break your universe. If you've done one thing in the past, you want to make sure it replicates anywhere else, so it doesn't mess up your own universe. Now, everyone says, why do you have wings on your ship? Well, I never thought for a second anyone would think that these could generate lift and fly. There are no rudder, there are no ailerons or flaps. For me, in my universe, I use the wings as a way to generate. They're the shield generators. They're the actually emitters that emit what's needed. Now, a lot of times in sci-fi, certain things are just taken care of and just written off, like the ship has shields. Well, how do the shields get deployed? Is there a special, is the ship covered in something so it can emit the shield? Is it generated from the center of the ship? What's the power source? So for me, it became important with the design that all the ships I designed would have to have certain features that would replicate through the fleet. They all have to have wings, which will serve as the shield emitters. The front of the ships would always have to have the same type of grill marks, like right there. On the wings, as the same with the nose of the ship, to help wrap the ship in its shield. And the concept there, what originally started it, the Earth has a magnetic field, which is generated by this spinning metal iron core of our planet, which goes out through the top and bottom of the planet. So flip that on its side and put a pair of wings, and that's how the emitter field is wrapping the ship. Now, those intakes aren't intakes. Those are actually my navigational sensor arrays for when the ship is jumping to hyperspace. So once that design became relevant, that became the new sensor scoops. So those aren't intakes, that's actually a sensor scoop, and in some cases I've weaponized my sensor scoops. Now, the other question I constantly get is, why do I use tank turrets and why don't I just take 5 hours longer and build new turrets and design my own? It's because in one ship I built, I used a Merkava gun turret that I had 3 different scales of. And once that happened, that meant that every other ship in that fleet should have the same type of turrets. And these aren't turrets like in other sci-fis. These are rail guns, and also capable of shooting actual weaponized shells, you know, shells that can detonate and whatnot. So that started that. Plus, I'm a product of my, I guess you could say, my generation. I grew up in the late 70s, early 80s. And I used to watch shows such as Star Blazers with a space battleship Yamato, which is probably, I must have drawn the Yamato 1,000 times. So when it came time to do guns, that would be my biggest influence, would be to use, you know, that type of model. And then I started using the tank turrets. Plus, this is kit bashing. You're using what you have, and I could not achieve that kind of that kind of detail. You know, so it's tank turrets are the best way to go. And for people that don't like my tank turrets, well, when you design something, you design it any way you want. But for my universe, I like using tank turrets in different scales. And because I'm from that generation where, you know, I grew up watching Space Battleship Yamato on Star Blazers, and then, you know, every Jerry Anderson show that ever came out, from the Thunderbirds to the show UFO, with their interceptors, to just about any tech they use, the Thunderbirds. I used to love watching Thunderbird 2 get loaded. And that's one thing I noticed about the Thunderbirds in kids shows back then. They took a long time to assemble a ship or a ship to fly. You got to actually see the ship. That might be some of the influence why I show my models in as much detail as I do, because things are just too fast. I'm a practical effects person. I believe that models should be done, not CG. Now, CG has its place, but everything starts looking the same. The eye can tell when it's not realistic. And when you look back on models such as the Nostromo from Alien or the Discovery from 2001, they still look better than any CG you've seen today. But to address certain things, why there are no lights, my ships are like submarines. They run silent. They're not advertising their position unless their engines are on. And that's another thing. I don't believe having an engine on constantly. Sometimes in sci-fi, I don't understand why the engine's on burning constantly. I have sublight thrusters, which you saw in the video. The main engines only ignite when the ship jumps to hyperspace. And in my universe, it just, you know, that's how, once you've started that thing with one ship, to keep your universe as a whole so you don't break your own universe. So every ship has to have wings for shield emitters. There's no lights. I do have running lights or signaling lights, but they're just not necessary for these models. They're not needed for these, you know, models. But what you will see in this video is coming up is a time lapse of me generating the panels. Now, this took a real lot of time. And then, because of these doors that you're seeing right here, this whole ship's design was based on a concept where a platform would lower, a multi-mission launch platform would lower, and then that way the concept was that I could load any type of missile or fighter craft that I wanted carrying a missile. And the idea was one door would lower down, and you'd have a cargo container with missiles in it. And you know, it could be anything that the ship could use to carry. Secondly, I'm using kinetic kill devices, the concept of a torpedo that travels almost the speed of light, which, if you've understood the concept of something traveling that fast, the mass is incredible. And that was the idea for this ship's main design, was I didn't want a launch torpedo tube that could just continue to fire. I wanted these platforms that could lower and launch any type of ordnance I needed. And that's pretty much what went into this design, and that's why it has a unique look. These doors drop. So I had to decide that when I was coming time to do this for the director's guide, that I'd have to build the multi-mission launch platform or do a quick mock-up of it. And the mock-up would be done so I could then superimpose it and do the animation that you saw at the beginning of this video, which I tried to make it look like old-time gun camera footage, as if someone were flying by with a handheld. I hope that came off right. That was 7 months to get that to work. Well, these are the panels. and the beginning of this next project. So please enjoy the time lapse, and at the end of this I'll start the multi-mission launch platform, which I used nothing but printouts to do it, because it did need to be incredibly detailed since it would be photographed from far away. Well, here's the beginning of the panels. What I did is I traced the panels that I wanted to create, cut them out on paper, then glued them to some black mat board, and then scanned them in so I could have an initial pattern to go with. Yes, there is a typo in Warhawk. I dictate everything. My computer is set up. It's voice activated. Everything I do is with dictation. And as you know, with dictation, it's not sometimes accurate. So yes, there is a typo, but that's placeholder text, because I hadn't figured out yet what type of font I wanted to use for the name of the ship. But you'll see the weathering techniques. Basically, the model had to be stripped down, repainted, and that's basically what this video, this time lapse will show. I'll show how each panels, how the panels were done as I went through each step of it, and I hope you enjoy. So prepping the model, basically everything in red, I had to go over and put white. I used Tamiya flat white. I've had some times where you go to repaint the model, the red would actually change the base color. It would actually bleed through and you have a little darker area. And I decided that these would be the panels I would replace in some cases, and in other cases not. Basically the new panel idea was going to change the entire overall theme of the model. But she's old, and there was a lot of work that needed to be done. Plus, the other thing was the dust. And again, this model is mainly cardboard and mat board with just very few model parts. And so this was going to be really a risk, because I'm going to have to, when I'm done, wash the model with watered down black flat Tamiya paint to give it that stained look. And there was a big fear that I was worried about buckling or warping, but she was so saturated with gray primer that I thought I'd be okay if I just did it lightly. But that's why I'm going through painting everything that's red white, because as I get ready to repaint the model, I want to make sure that red does not show through and give me a darker deal. Plus, again, all the markings had changed, and this was a real opportunity to try something brand new, which was to make printouts for the decals, and this way I could have the logo of the ship and the mission marks, like on a World War II B-17. So. Well, I hope you enjoy the rest of this time lapse. We've just begun it. To address some other issues, I've also been asked why I don't use an airbrush. It's only for the simple reason because I can achieve all the looks I want and get the type of look I want with the tools I use. Using a stiff dry brush to add that stained look. With an airbrush, it just, for me, always looks sort of like an airbrush. Plus, I used to have a beautiful Iwata airbrush. And it's just one of those things, I swear it just sits in the box. I never have that much use to use it. I'm able to just kind of achieve the looks I want the way with the tools I use. Now here I'm adding some extra piece to the model. This has always been missing from the original piece. I'd run out of the type of cardboard I originally used until I found this new stuff. And so there was some minor repairs to the model, parts that had snapped off or things that needed to be worked on. But here was just getting her back to where she's supposed to be. And again, there's just so much went into this project for the director's guide. as I've stated earlier, I love practical effects. CG does have its place, but as I was getting into the director's guide, I felt it was really important to show what those doors are for and why the ship is designed the way it is, so it can launch. Now, at the end of this time lapse, another one will begin, which will be the multi-mission launch platform, and I'll have some more to talk about that. But enjoy the rest of this time lapse before the next one starts. also wanted to state that these are paper decals. This way they can be pre-stained. They are light sensitive, so this is just to get the model camera ready. And so they are light sensitive, so they won't last forever. I've had other paper decals I've used that have lasted about 10 to 15 years before they start to fade a little. But since the model's not sitting in direct sunlight, you really get just exactly the look I want. The printer I use makes a great flat piece of paper, but you can see a little bit of my studio there. But again, enjoy the rest of this time lapse, and I hope you'll enjoy the time lapse for the MMLP multi-mission launch platform. We have now reached the MMLP multi-mission launch platform time-lapse. As you saw before it started, there were some images I would like to reference. One of them was just to show you some examples of the multi-mission launch platform, as well as things that you've seen in the earlier video, and as well as the Moran TBF Avenger, which is a torpedo bomber. And that was what totally came about, why this is being generated. Because of the director's guide and updating the ship, I really wanted to illustrate for the director's guide. I thought it was important to show why the ship is has this uniquely designed aesthetic to it. It's because of these launch platforms. And what basically came about was I could have built a platform to scale with the ship, but it would have been really small. It wouldn't have had the detail I wanted. So I thought the best way to do this, when I planned to do this opening shot, it all came out of an animation. I decided I wanted to show the Warhawk as if it were, like, as I stated earlier, gun camera footage, like archival footage of another ship flying by, or a fighter craft flying by, and a co-pilot with a handheld documenting this ship. And I thought, if I'm going to do that and achieve the look I want, since I have a very unique style and I've worked very hard to develop that style, I realized I was going to have to animate the opening. And I thought, if I'm going to have the platform lower out, or at least give an example of this platform lowering out, I'd have to build one. So the thought was I would build it big enough that I could photograph it, superimpose it into the position I need so I could do the animation. And that meant I didn't need to go too wild and detailed. However, I had to come up with a way that I could give it the right amount of detail, and when it shrunk down, this way the scale of the detail would match the ship. And since the model is a 350 scale model, you know, it became an issue of, okay, how am I going to do this? I thought, I'll have to make the platform big enough, and I thought printouts would be the best way to go. This way I could give it all the detail I wanted in the printout, and since it was going to be photographed and shrunk down, I wouldn't have to use excessive model parts. Most of everything could be taken care of with the printouts. So that was the whole point of doing this with printouts, was it was the only way I could see that when I photographed it and shrunk it down, that when it was superimposed, the look of it would seem to match the proper scale and size of the main ship. And that was, you know, as I was doing this, I wasn't sure if it was going to work, but it worked amazingly better than I thought it would. Again, it was a gamble, but when you're an artist, you really try to challenge yourself. You try new things. I find it's very important to always try something that scares you a little, you know, really pushes you forward. And, you know, here, I'd already used the printouts on the ship to give it a new look, and that thought, well, you know, this could work with building a mock-up of this platform. And this would allow me to give it all the detail I need, and again, photographing it and shrinking it down would make the look of it match the scale. You know, the detail would be in the right perspective, the right scale for the model, and then that way, you know, nothing would be lost in its design and detail. And again, that's pretty much what went into this project, was that I wanted to do this multi-mission launch platform, which is sort of inspired as a Patriot missile battery. I thought this would be perfect, a platform that will lower, and you can put any type of cargo container with a launcher on the platform, and as well as, do you want to use a missile launcher, or would you want to use it to launch torpedo bombers? And since I was trying to come up with another way to have a ship that acts like a carrier but is not, if it was going to fire torpedoes, I didn't want to have the front of the ship with like 4 or 5 torpedo ports where it could just keep firing. I thought, you know, let's have this platform have a multi-purpose, and then this way the cargo container type concept with missiles in it, like a Patriot missile battery, meant that you could load any type of ordnance you want on these launch platforms. And then I also wanted to, you know, keep it open to where I could launch a fighter craft. Now, I ran out of time. This has already been like 5 to 7 months worth of work, and I've been working on other models as well. And I really wanted to build the fighter in the right scale to match the platform, but that just would have taken it into another couple months. And so I said I just included an image of it. And at the end of this time lapse are pictures from the director's guide, where you'll see a digital one I did of it in the launch platform. So it is represented, but eventually I will build one of those models. That model was that fighter craft was actually built in a very early version of 3D Studio Max, a very low polygon model. And so, you know, it just was a quick design. I think it's funny, I used the computer to design it and figured, you know, I would eventually have to build it as a practical model, and that's coming down the road. But here, this was incredibly tedious, making the printouts and gluing them to black core matte board, because it's acid free, so it'll never yellow the printout, and then assemble this with printouts, and it gave me the right amount of detail I needed. And as you can see there, the missile launcher is a little bigger there. I can just see there I've cut it in half. I didn't, because I wanted to add a point defense turret on the platform. I thought when this platform lowers down, it might be a little vulnerable, and I thought a point defense missile turret, guided missile turret, would be the best way to defend the platform and make the ship have a more dangerous profile. So whether you're launching a torpedo bomber or firing off these missiles, the platform has its own defense. And because I wasn't sure of how everything was going to fit, I knew the front of the launcher. That was the only part I dedicated the printout to. The rest, I knew I could make it long and then come back and cut it to whatever length I wanted to make the container the right size. I didn't want to go too long. I wanted to leave enough room for the missile turret, the points defense missile turret, and it was going to be tight either way. I wanted the turret to be able to rotate if it's launching a fighter craft, but aim out the back to defend the, because it's, you know, guided missile, it doesn't have to be aimed directly at it, but it is a point defense turret. And so here I'm using very little model parts. It was not much needed to just give a little form, because again, this was just to be a quick mock-up that I could photograph and shrink down so the detail would hold. You know, if I built it super small, it wouldn't have had the kind of detail I wanted. And here, this was just the perfect size to make it, and then photograph it in the right position so I could superimpose it and then animate the whole thing in Photoshop. So that's what went into this project, just because I wanted to show this model for the director's guide and really show why it's designed the way it is. So you'd have to represent the launch platforms in some way. And even though it's just a quick scene in the beginning where it fires off, you get the idea. And plus, you know, when I'm doing a production Bible, you know, you want to show certain elements, you know, well, what actually the ship does. So for the pages of the director's guide, now you'll see this launch platform. It'll be in better detail. It photographed wonderfully, and the printouts worked so much better than I thought. It was actually a really interesting way to build a prop really quick. It was a nice new challenge to be able to photograph this, shrink it down so it wouldn't lose its detail, and it was a perfect scale to go with the model. Well, we're almost halfway through this time lapse. I hope you're enjoying this. This is just me documenting for my director's guide, Magnesium Bow, for my production Bible. You know, here I'm hoping to, you know, share what I'm doing, to document what I'm doing more for my director's guide, but maybe share some tips along the way. They're not technically how-to videos in this sense. I'm not doing anything that any, you know, if you've built any model, this would be nothing beyond you. This was just a new kind of creative way to build a quick mock-up that I could shrink down and not lose any detail. And actually, you know, at first my thought was, well, it wasn't going to be too detailed, and I only mean by that is that there wouldn't be a lot of model parts on it. I would use the printouts to achieve most of the looks I wanted for it. So, but we're about halfway through, so please enjoy the rest of this time lapse. I hope you're enjoying it. Thank you so very much for checking my stuff out, and stay tuned for, at the end of this time lapse, there'll be a shot showing the platform finished. Again, sorry I didn't build the fighter craft. It would have added too much time, but it was more important. I really wanted to show this missile launcher and do a quick little animation with it working. There's the point defense gun turret being built. Now that once I've figured out the size and how much room I had to work with, you know, you have an overall vision in your mind, but even so, you have to, sometimes it's a scratch building. You gotta kind of make it up as you go along. So there's my little guided missile turret. And again, I'm sorry I didn't build the torpedo bomber, but it is represented in pages of the director's guide, which you'll see at the end of this time lapse, which appears right after I show off the finished product of this cargo container missile launcher that goes on the MMLP multi-mission launch platform. Again, thank you so very much. Enjoy the artwork. And my name is Lance Wolf, and this is Ironwolf Productions. Thank you very much.